In his recent book, Legitimacy, the Right to Rule in a Wanton World, Arthur Applbaum tries to show that a formal institution, in this case, a government, can be what he calls a free moral agent. While there are strict qualifications, not every state will function in this way, and most won't, Applebaum's argument tries to hold open the possibility that at least some formal institutions could function as moral persons in their own right, over and above the status of their constituent members. For those of us who are interested in the issue of the moral agency of formal groups, Applebaum's theory presents a fresh approach, and furthermore, I think that the refutation of Applebaum's argument is a helpful new way of clarifying a thesis that I and many others have defended elsewhere. I want to begin by unpacking a few ambiguities that I see in Applebaum's account of free agency, and then I will go on to lay out some of the difficulties I have with Applebaum's attempts to apply this account to group agents. Against Applebaum's account, I will argue that a formal group agent must be a wanton. By free moral agency, Applebaum says that he means both internal and external freedom in sufficient amounts. External freedom requires that an agent's choice of ends not be subject to the control of another person, and that their innate powers or properly acquired means not be destroyed or unilaterally appropriated by another person's choices. External freedom is in this way to be contrasted with various forms of domination. By internal freedom, Applebaum means autonomy or competent self-governance. This competency for Applebaum consists of three essential capacities or their functional equivalents. These capacities he calls considering, willing, and doing, and they seem to be hierarchized in such a way that having a capacity is also a condition for having the ones that follow it on the list. By doing, Applebaum means having one's actions result from one's choice. And by willing, he means being able to choose in light of relevant reasons. In this way, willing in turn rests upon considering, which Applebaum consistently describes as, quote, a capacity to respond to reasons for action, endorsing some and rejecting others. This capacity for consideration, which is a necessary condition for the other two capacities on his list, is somewhat ambiguous. If consideration is a capacity for responding to reasons for action, then it's also important to specify what sort of reasons a free moral agent must have the capacity to respond to. There are, broadly speaking, at least two very different ways of interpreting the phrase respond to reasons, and they will present us with two very different conceptions of free agency. The reasons in question could be the agent's own. This is the conception of free agency at work in Frankfurt's account of freedom of the will. Here the idea is, in brief, that agents are capable of being moved by various desires, but freedom of the will demands that we be capable of identifying our wills with some desires, endorsing them, and not others, rejecting them, such that we are only moved to act by the desires that we choose to act upon. Inasmuch as this is a problem or project for creatures like us, we are persons, whereas an agent who is incapable of either wanting or not wanting to be moved by certain desires is a wanton. Given that Applebaum specifically contrasts free moral agency with wantonism, it seems right to interpret his notion of consideration in this way, and I shall primarily do so in what follows. However, the ambiguity here comes from the fact that a set of theories very different from Frankfurt's about what it means to have free will has come to be known as reasons-responsive theories. For a reasons-responsive theory, free moral agency is a matter of being responsive to what we might call external reasons, primarily rational and moral reasons. In stressing the ability of an agent to be responsive to reasons like this, a reasons-responsive theorist looks to situations of brainwashing and manipulation rather than addiction as the interesting cases. I think it's significant, for example, that the word wanton doesn't appear anywhere in Fisher and Ravitza's seminal book, Responsibility and Control. As Michael McKenna and Chad Van Scherlent point out, reasons-responsive theories are primarily ways of accounting for free will in terms of how an agent is externally related to her environment. By contrast, so-called mesh theories of free moral agency, like Frankfurt's, are attempting to account for freedom of the will in terms of the internal states of the agent. Hence, an issue like wantonism is a key area of concern. Now, as I see it, the distinction between these two approaches to free moral agency is important for our purposes because Applbaum seems to equivocate between them. He clearly says near the beginning of Legitimacy that a free moral group agent must have a capacity for second-order reflection, and he early on identifies wantonism as a failure of free moral agency. However, in his attempt to show how a group agent might overcome the threat of wantonism, Applbaum will focus most of his efforts on showing that a group agent can be responsive to rational and moral reasons for action, both in taking its actions and in offering reasons to justify those actions. Now, I think that any sufficiently complete reading of Fisher and Ritza, for example, would show that a group agent cannot be a free moral agent on their account. The very features by which they determine that, say, smart animals, children, and psychopaths are not moral agents, I think will also rule out formal institutions like governments and corporations. Nevertheless, that argument will have to wait for another paper. In the limited time that I have here, I will be making a more restricted argument, that a group agent must be a wanton. In arguing that Applebaum's suggestions are unable to overcome wantonism, then, I will simply set aside some of his comments on possible reasons-responsive mechanisms in group agents. They will be irrelevant for our purposes, whether or not I think they ultimately hold up on their own merits. If, as I've just charged, some of the resources Applebaum offers us for establishing free moral group agency simply sidestep the issue of wantonism, then it might be helpful to briefly reconstruct Frankfurt's concept of wantonism, at least as I understand it. Wantons, by Frankfurt's famous description, are agents who have first-order desires, but who are not persons, because whether or not they have desires of the second order, they have no second-order volitions. Now, notice importantly that Frankfurt says that wantons have no second-order volitions, whether or not they have second-order desires. And so the capacity for second-order desires will not be sufficient for showing that an agent is capable of free moral agency. What then is this second-order volition that the wanton does not possess? Frankfurt distinguishes between what he calls two different second-order desires. A second-order volition is the desire to have a desire be one's will. It is a desire not just to have a certain desire, but for that desire to be the cause of one's actions. Lacking a second-order volition, the wanton does not care about his will, Frankfurt writes. His desires move him to do certain things without it's being true of him either that he wants to be moved by those desires or that he prefers to be moved by other desires. This entails an incapacity or a mindless indifference to the enterprise of evaluating his own desires and motives. We should therefore distinguish wantonness from akrasia or weakness of will. For as Frankfurt says, when a person acts, the desires by which he is moved is either the will he wants or the will he wants to be without. When a wanton acts, it is neither. Now, in order to show why a group agent must be a wanton, let me now turn to the question of group agency. Intentional group agency is, of course, a widely discussed topic within the fields of business ethics and social ontology. And I believe it is by now well established that some types of group agents can have intentional agency over and above the intentions and actions of their constituent members. To be clear, however, this is not asserting much. Daniel Dennett and John Danley both use the example of a chess-playing computer. As Danley says, it is perfectly correct to say that, quote, the computer intends to respond PK4 to my king pawn opening. And furthermore, Dennett writes, I can calculate, under auspicious circumstances, the computer's most likely next move, provided I assume that the computer deals rationally with these beliefs and desires. That is, its beliefs about the rules and location of the pieces, and its desire to win. Frankfurt, for his part, allows that a rational creature who reflects upon the suitability of his desires of one course of action or another may nonetheless be a wanton. While the rational wanton may make significant use of instrumental reason, what distinguishes the rational wanton from other rational agents is that he is not concerned with the desirability of his desires themselves. As Danley, Dennett, and Frankfurt all show us then, rational intentional agency is a necessary condition of moral personhood, but not yet sufficient. Insufficient as it is for moral personhood, rational intentionality is still a condition that, of course, not just any group will fulfill. For a group to qualify as a rational agent, it's not enough that it displays a robust pattern of attitudinal and behavioral rationality, as Philip Pettit puts it. Pettit notes that groups constituted through meshed aims and plans will generally exhibit such rationality thanks to the rationality of their individual members. Such a group would behave as an intentional group agent, but the rationality would not be the rationality of the group agent. For a group agent to qualify as a moral agent, its rationality must be autonomous. To put it in Pettit's terms, it needs to be an autonomous agent. And a group agent will fail to be autonomous if the attitudes ascribed to it, if you like, the group mind, is just a function of the corresponding attitudes adopted by the members, whether independently or under some scheme of coordination. For the group agent to have its own mind, that is, its own rationality and intentional agency, it requires a constitution by procedure. And Applbaum points out, not just any procedure will do. The issue, which has been discussed extensively by Philip Pettit and Christian List, both separately and in their joint work, is the condition of robust group rationality. It requires that procedures for determining group attitudes and intentions be structured such that by the given organizational design, consistent and complete group attitudes are guaranteed. Rather than merely tying the group agent's will to the vector sum of constituent members' inclinations, as through a direct majoritarian rule on issues as they arise, the organizing structure contains hard-coded logic constraints. When the propositions on the agenda have non-trivial logical connections, these constraints ensure that the group will is logically self-consistent. By way of such organization, the group agent can itself be regarded as rational, rather than simply relying parasitically on the rationality of its constituent members. In List and Pettit's terminology, the mind of the group agent supervenes in this way on the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of its members. The actions and attitudes of the members are still the raw materials of the group agent's actions and attitudes, but are no longer causally determinate of them. When rational constraints are hard-coded into the structure of the formal institution, then the rationality of the group agent successfully supervenes on the rationality of its constituent members. The group agent can now be said to be a rational intentional agent distinct from the agents who are its members, which is, as Pettit has put it, the salient, if not the only way in which a group agent can be an autonomous agent. But, as impressive as all of this organization is, the group agent has in this way merely been established as an intentional system, taking its place among chess-playing computers, thermostats, and maybe even apple trees. Having shown that being an intentional system is not sufficient for moral agency, Dennett introduces the idea of a second-order intentional system to begin to capture the missing conditions. Now, Frankfurt, meanwhile, suggests that reflexivity seems much more fundamental and indispensable than that of hierarchy for explaining the difference between a wanton and a moral agent. In other words, a mere hierarchy of desires is not the same as having second or third order desires. The difference between a reflective moral agent and a wanton is that a reflective agent, by reflectively identifying himself or herself with his or her volitional complex, becomes, in Frankfurt's words, a genuine participant in the internal conflict between her various desires. She does not derive her agency from the outcome of this conflict, rather, she applies her agency to it. This requires more than the algorithmic sorting of desires within a rational intentional system. It requires a sense of one's own agency. But what would it require for a group agent to overcome wantonness? What would it take for a group agent to be a free moral agent? A group agent would have to be shown to be capable of not merely hierarchizing its own desires and impulses, but of identifying itself with its own volitional complex. It would require the group agent to have a sense of its own agency, such that it could conceive of itself as a participant in the struggle between various competing impulses. And that would require the group agent to have an internal reflective distance from its own impulses, beliefs, and desires, such that it would be possible for that group agent to have its own second-order desires, wanting to be motivated by some desires and not others. Is there a procedure, structure, or device by which a group agent can accomplish any of this? I believe that there are good reasons to say that there are not. Recall that for a group agent to be autonomously rational, the rationality must be structurally wired into the procedures that constitute the group will. If the rationality of the group agent is merely parasitic on the rationality of the individual constituent members, then the group agent itself is not a distinct rational entity. Likewise, then, in order for a group agent to be reflective, the reflective distance must be not merely parasitic on the reflective agency of the constituent members. Internal reflection and a sense of its own agency must somehow happen at the procedural level of the group as an institution. While rationality can be hardwired into group constitution in a way that makes it supervene, I believe that reflection cannot. Now, I've fully accepted the claim that a group agent, at least properly so constituted, can be a rational, intentional agent, capable of holding beliefs, having desires, and acting on inclinations. But what specifically do we mean when we say this? Some comments by Philip Pettit are incredibly instructive. Now, what Pettit observes here is that in order to know what the desires of a group agent are, we have to look to its active intentions. Other desires may be proposed at the level of the discussion between the constituent group members, but these desires do not become the desires of the group agent itself until they are ratified as intentions. In the absence of such intentions, it is incorrect to say that the group agent itself actually has the desire. But this means, of course, that it's impossible to ever say that the group wants to have a different intention than it has, or that the group does not want to have the desire that it desires. Because, as Pettit points out, these intentions are binary, on or off. Then the best we can do is to see the group change its mind. Yesterday it wanted X, but today it no longer does. Because the group's beliefs only exist as active judgments, and its desires only exist at the level of active intentions, it is incapable of reflectively separating itself from its beliefs and desires. It therefore cannot conceive of itself as a participant in the struggle between internal desires. For in a sense, we can say that the group agent is its beliefs and desires. Its existence as an agent is determined by them. Now, if a group agent isn't a wanton, then it's not an autonomously intentional agent at all. Either the intentional agency of the group is merely parasitic on the rational agency of its constituent members, or the group agent is a rational wanton. Whether a state, a corporation, or any other institutionalized group, our model for independent group agency should not be that of the moral person, but rather the chess-playing computer. The question for us is not how to build a morally free group agent, but rather how to change, preserve, or defend specific artificial arrangements in the form of formal organizations.